Globespan. I am Paul Nero Tennessee of Guyana, and today on Globespan, we would like to introduce a concept program that was used some time ago, but the owner of the program of Globespan, Mr. Nohar Singh, would like it to be reintroduced, and I don't think it's a bad idea. It's called the People's Voice, and we are going to test a new methodology uh, in these programs. Every third Wednesday in each month, we usually have this program. And there are other programs on Mondays and so forth, but we do the third Wednesday in each month. Now, today we are going to be dealing with a specific subject, impact and possibilities for the grassroots. We are trying to get the grassroots, people from the communities, to make an input into the program. And today we will discuss floods, climate change, COVID-19, and oil. It's a big agenda. But you know, Guyana today is facing not one problem or two problems, there are multiple problems. Now, this is how we would like in the future to develop the program. People will have the opportunity to voice their concerns and challenges, to which the panelists can comment or give their opinion on what issues are raised. Now, you could be in Papua New Guinea or Nigeria, or you could be in Region 1, Region 2, Region 10, Region 9, Region 4, any region in Guyana, and you could do a simple thing. You could use your phone and record for 2 minutes a video and a video of your voice, and then when you have that video for 2 minutes, then you do a WhatsApp. You use WhatsApp and you video to 1-631-782-9272. We are going to put it up on the screen. You call that number 631-782-9272 by WhatsApp, and you upload the video. And then we will have the video before our programs and we will put them up. And that would be part of the program for discussions. We are trying to connect as much as we can with Guyanese across the world, both at home and abroad. So I will, at different points, repeat this new idea with the hope that some of our viewers, there are quite a lot of viewers we've been having, that they can participate. So I would like to begin the discussion now about Guyana. Currently, we are facing a lot of problems impacting on our country and our people. And some of them are floods, climate change, which is usually linked to floods and go beyond it, COVID-19, and oil. And so I'm going to begin by just making a comment that I read with great interest the presentation of His Excellency Irfan Ali, Dr. Mohammed Irfan Ali, to the 12th Parliament of Guyana. His presentation was entitled A Unified Pathway to Prosperity. And it was a very interesting document from the point of view that I think that he has made a lot of promises that he seems to feel very confident that his government would be implementing. One of the things he spoke about is national emergency. He says we have a national emergency. We have had the ravages of COVID-19. I think when he made this speech, the floods were not on as yet, so this has to be added on. And but his speech still stays in context. He said that the elderly, single mothers, and children were the worst affected in the current crisis of the COVID. And he says that his government was committed to supporting livelihoods of families, small business. He spoke a bit of the fact that they now had a budget after many years approved by Parliament, which is addressing these issues. And then recently there was an emergency budget. And he spoke about oils and local content, holding companies accountable, trying to verify production and other expenditures and so forth. Then he spoke also about our sovereignty. or sovereignty in terms of the Venezuela border problem. And very interesting, he has this concept of one Guyana, and he says that there would be a legislation for a commission to have this one Guyana commission. And then he continued with the promise they did in their manifestos of creating 50,000 jobs. So that is about the head of state in Guyana, who it seemed quite confident that he would be able to deliver in spite of all the challenges that we face. So today we have with us, as usual, Mr. Timothy Jonas, who is a senior counsel and chairman of a new and united Guyana, which participated in the last election, and with two other political parties, they have a member in parliament. We have Mr. Wayne Ford, a founder and president of United Guyana Diaspora Global Network Corp. And he has been very active in the diaspora community. He's recently been in conference with people at the Foreign Office in Guyana and conferences they have been having on issues related to participation of Guyanese abroad. And then we should have with us, he was in Guyana until 2 days ago. I don't know how his flight is, if he is here, but Professor Floyd Haynes, from the president of Roraima Institute and businessman, is supposed to join us, and probably he will. So, gentlemen, can we begin to having a discussion? And we always rely on Timothy because he's on the ground all the time. Timothy, how are you doing? Are you wearing long boots and raincoat in the floods? And how have you been managing at the, your personal level and your community with these challenges of the floods?
Hi, Paul. Good evening. The flood in Guyana has not seriously affected the urban areas in Georgetown and around Georgetown. Where it has been affected is actually the agricultural lifeblood. The upper Demerara area, up in Berbice, Blackbush, by the conservancies, going up the Berbice River itself on the Mara side, Kokwani, over the river in canals 1 and 2, there's been flooding. So it's been a problem where we are growing our crops. I understand in Pomeroon, although I don't have any specific information about there, that also in Essequibo there's been problems with the flooding.
Yeah. Wayne, have you been getting information as a member of the diaspora, always reaching out to people in Guyana? What kind of information you've been getting coming out to the diaspora? Well, we are not hearing you, Wayne. Wayne, we are not hearing you.
Hi, good evening.
Oh, good.
Yeah. All Guyanese who are aware of this disaster are concerned about what's going on in Guyana. And it's reminiscent of the 2005 floods, which I think affected Region 4 more than anything else. This seems to be a nationwide problem. So many organizations are doing what they can to raise funds to assist those who were badly impacted by these floods. We are aware, and I think everyone is paying attention to the newest developments as they become revealed to us, and we're hopeful that the problem will be resolved soon, and that the waters will recede, and we can get some sense of normalcy. The problem is that it's compounded by COVID-19, and further compounded by the fact that there's a tremendous inflation problem in Guyana. The price of food products and gasoline have all increased, and the poor man is becoming a smaller man without any signs of hope in that regard. That's my take from this.
Okay. You raise a very important point, the rising prices of food, because I have received, I have a lot of network in Guyana, and I get regular information about this and photos. So in canal number one, for example, I am aware, families who have their small production and they go to the Leonora market every Saturday. But if they get wiped out, then they have nothing to take to the Leonora market to sell. So what they would be doing now is going to Leonora market to purchase. Now they depend on that production to give them an income when they go to the market. Now you're going to the market with which income? So you are right. The situation is very, very difficult. And I think Timothy made that point when he compared the urban with the rural agricultural areas. And this is this is what we call the backward multiplier effect that, you take money out of people's hands and you have this crisis, the inflation. Now, you mentioned inflation. What did you really mean by inflation? That prices have risen, but people don't have the income. That's correct, right, Wayne?
Yeah, absolutely. Prices for daily consumer products that can fit into an average basket of 12 or so have increased, including gasoline, but the price of the wages taken home or the income earned by the average person hadn't.
Timothy, how you view the cost of living? You think it will deepen poverty in big numbers? I know you don't have any statistics or so, but from your observation of and reading and knowing and meeting what's going on, how do you view that? You think poverty will increase? We're now hearing you. Timothy?
I know Wayne mentioned the 2005 flood.
Yeah.
That, of course, was an enormous disaster, and that was centered where the population is. The thing with the 2005 flood is that it was the result of overtopping of the Conservancy and therefore affected Region 4. So from Georgetown going east, you were affected, and therefore the other areas, other side of the Mahika River, Berbice, Essequibo, no impact. The reason I mentioned that distinction is that where you just had that localized flooding, although the results were dramatic, the agricultural sector which was affected was largely the rice industry and the cash crop industry in this relatively narrow area. What we are seeing now is people affected who have traditionally been supplying, as you said, Paul, the markets, the cash crop people, the people who grow in Edo, pumpkin, cassava, yam, plantain, watermelons, melons. Now, those are the people who turn over a cash crop. They plant, they hoping to reap in 3 months. Beans, hoping to reap in 7 weeks, bring it to market. And when they are flooded, there's an immediate crisis because as cash crop farmers, they have a subsistence level. So first of all, for their own livelihood, they eat what they grow. If you go to a farm and a man planting Edo and pumpkin and that kind of thing, his diet is Edo and pumpkin and plantain, and he's fishing. So if he is flooded out, it's not just that he does not have means to sell anymore. He doesn't have cash crops to sell, but his own food security is affected.
I think that's a very important point.
And in addition, it's not localized. So you're seeing this all over the place. And that's where the tragedy is happening. So people's food security in the Upper Demerara is affected. And then those same people who traditionally will be bringing their cash crops to the town can't do so. So that the people in the urban areas are seeing prices skyrocket for ordinary basics like seasoning and provisions and that kind of thing. And as Wayne correctly points out, the mass of our population who live on the margins and continue to live on the margins and have not seen relief, they suffer first and they suffer the most. Now, I think that we have to understand this isn't a short-term problem either, because if that water goes down tomorrow, those hundreds of farmers are faced with dead crop that have been flooded, and they don't magically get to restore what was there. If they got a citrus farm and that's died, they got to start over. So we can't be thinking in terms of sending hampers. Hampers are very important. What's in the hampers is very important, but we have to be thinking of how to engage the pitiful infrastructural responses that we have, like NARI, to engage them and ensure that they are doing what they can to be providing watermelon seeds, pumpkin seeds, plantain suckers, Edo tubes, so that when the waters do go down, the farmers are immediately given the wherewithal to try to get things back going again, the seedlings, citrus, and that kind of thing. I don't know that that's happening, but that's something that needs to be done urgently from now. It can be something that you think about when the water's down and those farmers are looking at brown, dead land. So we got to be thinking about this, not just in the short term, but also in the medium term, how to solve what is an immense problem and a serious potential tragedy.
And Paul, if I may,
Wayne.
If I may continue the thought process that Timothy has laid out there, thinking forward and having the infrastructure mechanisms in place. Going back to 2005, here is that point as to how massive that was in Georgetown, the Georgetown area. The impact of that and corrective problems have not taken place. And what I mean by it, when we look at this from the perspective of critical infrastructure, and when I say critical infrastructure, I mean the physical and logical infrastructure assets that are essential for the minimum operations of the economy and government. The infrastructure that's necessary to preserve the safety, security, and economic well-being of the citizens are all threatened in one specific area when there's flooding. And we're talking about the Georgetown area. And what that means, it includes critical infrastructure that affects all Guyanese in areas of telecommunications, energy, banking and finance, transportation, water systems, emergency and government and private sector. So when we look at what happened in 2005, knowing that it's going to happen again and it can be worse, there have been no corrective measures in place to handle critical infrastructure in Guyana to protect it so that we can continue moving or trying to move the country forward. Climate change is real. We're 6 feet below sea level. Sea level rising is also real. It is not when, if, it's a matter of when it's going to happen to Georgetown and Guyana, going all the way up to Suicide, a flood that takes out the critical infrastructure. Think about it. Kingston Electricity Corporation, Garden of Eden, the substations, all the way there. They're right there on the coast in the path of a flood or rising waters. You've got a Bank of Guyana, you've got GRA, you have every bit of infrastructure critical to the functioning of Guyana right there. And it's a matter of time when this is going to be inundated and there's no provision in place. There's no agency in place to think about alleviating it, to think about handling it or stopping it before it occurs. But in addition to that, let's look at the vulnerability of all of these critical infrastructures. Remember the attack on the pipeline in the US that shut down the country to a certain extent and gasoline prices went all the way up. Pardon me?
I said cyber attacks.
The cyber attacks. That is another area of vulnerability of all of the critical infrastructure. Natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, we don't get that in Guyana, sites of criminal activities. It is very easy to walk into Kingston, to that the electric corporation, any criminal, and disable it, or up in Garden of Eden, disable it. We don't have a system in place to handle that. And you may argue that we've got the CDC, but the CDC's mandate is for disaster recovery. It is not to protect against criminal activity and cyber attacks. It's there to react. It's more reactive when something has occurred. so that we are going to be in a terrible place at some point in time, not just by floods, but by any other activities that can damage the infrastructure that we don't have a mechanism in place to handle. And I'll leave it here for some more thoughts by stating that the United States Act of 2002, Section 2.4, established the Department of Homeland Security. We don't have, in terms of policy area, anything that's remotely comparable to doing something like that to deal with working and hardening or critical infrastructure against the vulnerabilities of cyber attacks, criminal activities, and other types of disabling actions in Guyana that can set the country back for a very long time. And one last point. If Georgetown gets flooded and all the critical infrastructure is destroyed, we've got a problem. Why are we not thinking about moving our capital with a critical infrastructure to higher land? Brasilia did it. Brazil did that, moving it 600 miles inland Brasilia. Belize did that in the 70s, 80s. Why Forbes Burnham talked about it in the 70s? We're not thinking about it now. And guess what? We've got the resources to do it. The revenue coming in that are the Natural Resource Fund, 290 something million, I think it is, shouldn't be kept just for the next generation. It should be here to ensure that the next generation has the infrastructure and critical infrastructure in place to continue the process of promoting and ensuring prosperity in Guyana. So it's not waiting there for when people are born 40 years from now. Prepare the place for the next generation for a better quality of life, higher standard of living, reduce vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure so that the country can move forward. I'll slow down and stop at that point.
Well, you guys have raised quite a few important points. Getting back to Timothy's point with the grassroots, it's interesting, and we should take note that this dance between the subsistence economy and the cash crop economy, and the way Timothy explains it is very interesting, because people have food security because they're still within that subsistence kind of existence, but at the same time, the surplus they take to the market. Now both gets wiped out, then they are in serious trouble. And I read a report where a family was complaining. As a matter of fact, a lady said, and somewhere in the interior of Guyana, I don't know exactly the region, but it was mentioned, the region. She said that we have been wiped out, and all her husband and her were eating was plain rice. They had nothing to put on it but boiled rice. So the situation in the grassroots is dire. Now, Wayne, you have raised a number of issues that where you have argued that the infrastructure that you do not believe that we are in a state of preparedness. We have a system set up to deal with national emergencies. As the president said, there is a national emergency, but that emergency, as you said, is defined in a very narrow way. Timothy, what do you think about this whole idea of how the government or the people of Guyana should go about dealing with this infrastructure? Is it something that has to come now to the front burner? Instead of building roads, should we redivert those funds to the infrastructure?
We got some ridiculous notions about what's needed for drainage and infrastructure in Guyana. Now, first of all, let me immediately tell you, I do not know what the solution is for the inland regions, Kokwani, Upper Pomeroon, Upper Demerara. Those places that are above the Conservancy and traditionally should be above the level of the sea. Their flooding results from rainfall. And I do not know, and I'm not going to pretend to tell you that I know, how to solve that unbelievable flooding I saw pictures of in Kokwani. The people who live there say they've never experienced anything like that before. They are not below sea level, they are high, and yet the flooding was unbelievable. But to bring us back to your discussion, which is really the agricultural belt, which To take a hard and unsympathetic line is where Guyana's money is, where the agricultural industry is on the coast. We talk about the Dutch as if there was some single consciousness that designed the network of irrigation and drainage. That's not the case. What happened when there was settlement in Guyana is that the new settlers came up, and if you imagine, it's bush. There's no buildings they saw. So they used the rivers as access points and the sea, because they're coming by boats. They measure out how many roods for an estate, and they move inland, which is how we have the concepts of first depth and second depth. And between each plantation, they left a piece of state land, which nobody owned, and they called it the sideline dam. And that dam remains state land. So what evolved was a system of canals that ran the length of the estates out to the river or to the sea. And at the level of the sea or the river, there was some kind of usually ineffective sea defense with a coker so that the water could drain out. Now, if you look at this from an aerial point of view, the end result then is large canals, which we are familiar with if you live in regions 3 and 4 and 5, that lead out to the sea or lead out to the river, that are protected by cokers. And what happened around World War I is that there was an enormous sea defense project that ran from Essequibo all the way down to Berbice, that systematically sorted out the sea defense and built the groins and did a single defense so that we don't think about incursions from the sea for the last 100 years. Along the rivers, less so. But there wasn't a single Dutch government that came to do this. This was each plan to garden his own turf, digging canals on either side of his estate, so that if the neighbor flood, he won't flood because he put up a dam between him and his neighbor, and doing the best he can for his sea defense. Now, what we have done, that worked. And during the 1900s, when it was, when we nationalized is the wrong word, but when the government became involved in the sea defense, the cokers were maintained, not necessarily by government, but by Gaisuco and the sugar industry, the privately owned sugar industry, which was later nationalized and became Gaisuco. So that the boy gangs used to regularly go, used to cut the vegetation along the canals. When the tide dropped, used to raise the coker door, and all the vegetation used to wash out. And those same boy gangs used to be standing up, walking up and down in the canal to stir up the silt so that a clean washout could happen and the canals worked. And the reason the sugar estates did this was because it was in their own self-interest to have good irrigation and good drainage for good quality cane. Now, when we nationalized sugar, we began gradually to destroy that. So that if you look over the river on the west coast of the Demerara, where there used to be cokers going all the way from where the masjid is now, where the match factory is now, going south to Canal Number 2 into Wales, many of those cokers have been condemned so that they're no longer operating. The coker at Canal Number 2, which used to have 5 doors, now has 3 doors. So what happened as we decided in our wisdom that we didn't need as many cokers is that the quantity of water we could drain out in an emergency reduced. And that's the problem we have now. So that when we have heavy rainfall, we have a smaller number of cokers which are functioning with which we can drain the land. And therefore the water settles on the land. In Georgetown, we have an even worse situation. Georgetown is divided into wards, and each ward originally had its own drainage system. So you have the canal on Lamaha Street, you have the canal in Rumvelt, you have the canal that is by the museum that goes out past Monash Wars, the canal at Sussex Street. And each of those canals running east to west are the main drainage points. But when you look at how they are maintained and how the cokers work, you see that there has been squatting, there has been ingress on either side, so that the actual point of the cokers has been narrowed in some instances. You have seen that the drains aren't kept well, so that they become silted up, so that the speed with which you can drain water off has reduced. And then, of course, in Georgetown, we have the worst littering system around. So not only do we not maintain our drainage, but we throw rubbish in there with wild abandon.
Yep.
Now, we can't blame anybody but ourselves. There are other countries like Trinidad that have been reclaiming land and putting up buildings on reclaimed land. We haven't even been able to maintain what we inherited from the British. And we have nobody to blame for that but ourselves. And unless we understand that the system worked and the system would continue to work if only we maintained it. We talk about pumps. And every time I hear the government say, oh, we got to buy pumps to drain off the water, I shrug. You see, a canal and a coker is a self-scouring, self-cleaning system. When those boy gangs cut the vegetation and open that coker, any Guyanese who has seen it can visualize it. All the vegetation floating in that trench washes out. It is self-scouring. If you leave that coker door down and you have some pump that got a 24-inch diameter pipe and is pumping water over, you are not helping the flow of water and scouring the drain. What you're doing is you are creating a much smaller pipeline, literally, for the water to move out. And then you are depending on gasoline, on parts, on maintenance, and you are encouraging the siltation of the canal because there's no flow of water. We have to go back to what we inherited. We have to stop trying to pretend that we know about technology, and we got to do what we know.
You're making a that was a very, very good exposition of reality and a bit of historical flow. I also have knowledge in Region 6 in Ulverston, Alness, and Salton, because my grandfather was the chairman of the village council, my father was the overseer. So they had a full-time ranger who spent his time looking at these issues of drainage. What I noticed at the coker in Alness, and up to recently was in Guyana, I was there, it's totally abandoned. What we used to have is that when it got filled up with mud, and so they brought a drag line very regularly, and the drag line cleared it. And so the coker, when you open it and you close it, that was the ranger's job. Part of his job was to open it and put it down. And he kept an eye on the flow of water. So the coker system, I agree with you, it's an old Dutch system. I have been to Holland and had a quick look at some of these things in Holland, and it's very interesting, the whole concept of the coker. Now, gentlemen, we are going to take a break now at 7:35, and we'll be back in a few minutes, and we'll continue this conversation. But I think we have touched on a very important issue about the drainage and irrigation. And because I've always been one of those people who are thinking of moving into the interior, into highlands, also because of the point that was raised about Brasilia, where I was, but also right next to the Essequibo is Ciudad Guyana. And I've always been fascinated how the Venezuelans, through the Venezuelan Corporation of Guyana, they invested a lot of money. You have the Guri Dam, you had iron ore, iron smelter, and you had the bauxite and aluminium there. But how they carved out a city in the jungle there. And I've always thought that Guyana, we had to move in the highland, but once an old politician told me when I was up and down the country in the 80s talking about that, he said, Paul, be careful. The entire population of Guyana virtually make a living from this coastline. You got to start thinking of how you're going to keep the coastline, and you're just telling the people all the time about going into the interior. And I'm so happy that Timothy has raised that point. It's something for us to reflect. So we'll go on a break now, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Globespan is pleased to announce Curry Duck Curry Punta Cana 2021. Yep, it's Travelspan Curry Duck Curry with an inclusive vacation, 2-in-1 on August 12th to August 16th. Special performances by Terry Godraj, Sexy Marissa, the Tassamen, and the DJs are all going to Punta Cana on August 12th to August 16th. It's fun, games, party, and curry duck curry at VIK All-Inclusive Resort. All you can eat and all you can drink. TravelSpan has flights from JFK, Newark, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, and Houston directly to Punta Cana. It's TravelSpan Curry Duck Curry, and an all-inclusive vacation. It's 2-in-1 on August 12th to August 16th in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. All-inclusive packages include air, hotel, transfers, all meals and drinks from $9.99 persons. TravelSpan Curry Duck Curry is sponsored by allfromonesupplier.com, Dave West Indian. Call TravelSpan at 212-243-0865. That's TravelSpan at 212-243-0865 or book on travelspan.com. Allfromonesupplier.com has all your grocery needs, plus all of your West Indian items. Purchase all your groceries and all your West Indian items from one place and get free delivery to your homes and free shipping. Allfromonesupplier.com has free deliveries locally in New York and free shipping to all U.S. states. Our shoppers choose the best items, packaged nicely, and delivered to your home. We have all your grocery needs and all your West Indian items, a one-stop shop. So place all your orders on allfromonesupplier.com or call 718-551-3292. That's online at allfromonesupplier.com or call 718-551-3292. Get all your groceries and all your West Indian items from allfromonesupplier.com with free deliveries and free shipping to all U.S. states. Globespan 24x7 continues its efforts.
We're back on Globespan. And we are on the theme of the people's voice, the impact and possibilities for the grassroots, floods, climate change, COVID-19 and all. We had a very interesting discussion a few minutes ago about the whole question of the flooding. Now, we'd like to talk a little bit now about, evidently, this issue of climate change is also connected to floods. But what we are aware of that independent of when the conversation began years ago about climate change and so forth, Guyana have always faced this problem of that we had to take care of the coast because we were under the water, under the sea and sea level, and that we had to take care of drainage and irrigation. So this problem has been always with us. We are showing some photos right now about the extent of this problem. It's horrible. It's really terrible. Look what we are seeing. I'm glad our viewers are having a chance to do this, thanks to Devin. Look at that house, look at that car, look at everything. It's collapsed. It's a total collapse. It's frightening, it's frightening. And so there has to be a rethinking, I think, in the reallocation of resources, I think, and nothing is wrong with that. There was all this talk about oil money, and there were a list of things that were in the manifestos of each political party prior to the floods and COVID and so forth. And if we have to adjust, we have to adjust. And if we have to reprioritize, we have to reprioritize. So what we would like in this program is to get some videos like we just saw just now and people talking, and we are saying that you could take your phone in any part of the world you are, because we are interested in Guyanese both at home and abroad. Do a two-minute video, speak into it, any issue that affects you, whether you're in Britain or whether you are in Guyana, and send it to 631-782-9272, and we will show it like you saw the videos a minute ago. So we would like to speak a bit about now, to discuss a bit about, there has been this great expectation that oil revenues are going to come and we'll be able to use it to address or to apply it to a lot of the challenges that our country face. Now, in light of COVID, as a matter of fact, before we go to oil, let's talk a bit about COVID. Now, Wayne, from what you have been reading and looking at what's going around the world, each day Stabrook News, I look at Stabrook News and they give us a rundown on how many people died, how many people contracted, how many people are quarantined, which is very good, that we get to know what's going on. The numbers of contraction of COVID has been increasing. Now, Wayne, from what you have been reading, how do you believe Guyanese have been dealing with this issue? Do you believe, well, the floods is a problem that Timothy says and other people have said that the rain is not going to stop. It's going to go into August and it's going to be heavy. So we know that problem is going to continue. What about COVID? Are we seeing a light at the end of that tunnel?
We can look at it relative to our neighbors in the Caribbean there. For instance, Guyana is doing extremely well compared to Jamaica, where I think 9.6% of Guyanese are vaccinated, and in Jamaica it's possibly 1.6%. Although Jamaica has a larger population, the actual numbers in Guyana are greater. I think it's, correct me there, 300 something thousand. I'm not sure where Jamaica is, like probably 1/3 of their people have been vaccinated. I don't know why it's that way, but I think Guyana has been doing fairly well in trying to obtain vaccines and distributing it effectively. And the other question is, I think Guyanese are responding well to getting vaccinations. And Timothy will know better than I in that regard. What I do recall, and I was actually looking at an agreement between our organization and the Ministry of Public Health last year, when there was a tremendous shortage of PPE, even in the United States. And we were trying to source PPE for the Ministry of Public Health. The minister asked us to do infomercials to ask Guyanese to follow the protocols of social distancing and that sort of thing, because as she said, Guyanese say, man, I can drink some white rum and drink some bush rum or drink whatever, and COVID can't touch us. So they have that problem of Guyanese not being aware or not trying to apply the measures recommended by the CDC and other places. I think that has changed my view of it, observation or thoughts, that Guyanese are more aware of doing the right things, and Timothy will know better again in that regard. And so there has been some progress in terms of vaccination awareness and behaviors. And I think that the government has done fairly well compared to others in the region in terms of getting more Guyanese vaccinated.
Yeah, I remember that conference call with Valda Lawrence and the issues that were discussed there. There is a president in the Philippines, and he has said that he's going to put people in jail and he's going to catch citizens and get an injection on the buttocks so that they could get the vaccine. Now, I want to tell you that November last year, when I was in Guyana and I was back March this year, I came down at the hotel I was at and I went to the bar to get my food and some drinks. And there were about over 100 people there, and they were mostly young, and I was the only person with a mask. They were looking at me like if I come from another planet. Now, I was there at the same hotel in March. Quite a few people, even prominent citizens in Guyana, came to visit me there to have lunch and dinner and so forth, and they didn't have a mask. And I asked them, what happened? They said, man, you guys in America have a different problem. Now, I don't know if this is widespread. I don't know if something is being done. But Timothy, you probably are the best person being on the ground to tell us how this is going, and do you see a light at the end of this tunnel?
I think that this conversation got to start at the beginning. You see, when the superpowers hit on a vaccine and said, all right, we've saved the day, we have vaccines, there was this immediate supply and demand issue.
Yes.
And in fact, even in the first world, AstraZeneca came out and the manufacturers could not meet demand.
Yes.
And we saw hoarding. The Americans, as we all know, were quietly not letting any drugs leave their own factories. They were keeping it for themselves, waiting to get local approval, waiting to help their own before they helped anybody else. The only exception that I know of, and I may be wrong, is India. India was very generous as soon as they got the permission. You remember there was even the issue with the patent, that the pharmaceuticals said they've patented these vaccines and they didn't want others to start manufacturing them, even though lives were at stake worldwide. So the notable exception was India, and we got our first batch from India. And in light of that supply and demand issue, when the countries that manufacture the drugs were hoarding for their own people, we know that the third world is the last to get. And we know the third world has no money.
Yes.
And I think that Frank Anthony did a remarkably good job in following a clear policy to try to get early vaccines, as many vaccines as possible, to try to get us vaccinated. I believe that there were some mistakes made that I'd like to go into, but in terms of the overall approach, ensuring that in the villages, in the health centers, there were vaccines available. I went up the East Coast to get my vaccine. I've been vaccinated twice. I think that nearly 40% of the adult population, as the last statistic I saw, in Guyana has received one vaccine. Many have received two. I've received two. So the approach was good. They had drive-through vaccinations done at the Movie Town Mall and other places. They had lines. They used masjids in Ogle to encourage people to come and get vaccines. So they tried to make it as available and widely available, geographically speaking, as possible. It was a good program. It could always have been better, but it was well implemented, well thought out, well executed for the most part. Unfortunately, some issues arose that I think need to be looked at, because unfortunately in Guyana everything gets political. So we saw the leader of the opposition raise questions as to the source of the vaccines which we bought, the Sputnik vaccines. Having obtained free vaccines from India, we then had to seek recourse. We bought AstraZeneca and we bought Sputnik. And it turned out it was purchased from this UAE citizen who has been accused of overpricing and selling to various countries in the third world. Now, the issue became political. So the opposition immediately, with high volume, began to question the authenticity, the source, to say that we need to see the documents that show where these drugs came from, and also to justify the price paid. I think it was done too loudly and too shrilly, but it started a political tit for tat that was unfortunate and was unhelpful to the country as a whole. You see, everything that the opposition said was not unjustified. Some of the things they said were justified. Where you have the purchase of products at high cost and you do not follow procurement systems, and it turns out that you purchase not from the manufacturer but from a middleman, and it turns out that you pay twice as much as the world price. These are factors that need to be explained. They are not factors that say necessarily there was wrongdoing, because as I just said, there were many, many variables at play. The immense shortage of the drugs, the scarcity, the fact that we needed to find them, that will drive up the price. It's all possibly understandable. But the public is not satisfied and our leaders on both sides, government and opposition, are not doing their jobs and are not meeting their responsibilities to the public, when they begin a shrill exchange of attack and counterattack and do not answer what the people need to know. So I have seen that the authenticity of the drugs has now been demonstrated, and apparently it's met even the demands of the opposition, so that's apparently been put to rest. And to me, there was little doubt about that anyway, because at the end of the day, despite their hatred of each other and mutual suspicion, the individuals on both sides are patriots, and I don't think they'll be poisoning their own people or the other side by giving them false drugs. But we do have to remember as well that where we have a government accountable in terms of money, I personally would support paying more than the world price for the drug. I personally would support in an emergency bypassing the ordinary procurement methods to get a quick contract if you need to. But I would also urge, in fact demand, that all of those things having been done, there then needs to be full disclosure and a full explanation of how the process was done, how the transaction was undertaken, where the money was paid, so that an Auditor General examining what was done can represent independently that everything was done properly. More so in a country like Guyana, where corruption has existed for 50 years. This is not an accusation of anybody, and I want to reiterate, the government's health program and vaccination program has been splendid, has been very good. But when you are playing politics, and when you are faced with the history we've been faced with, good governance requires transparency. And if someone makes an accusation, the answer is not to say, oh, y'all are corrupt too. The answer is to say, this is what we've done and this is how we've done it. And I await that. Maybe it will come. We will see.
Yeah, I think that I teach government and political corruption, and looked at it all over the world. And I have discovered that each time we have a national disaster, whether it's America or any other part of the world, there are people there in the wings of society waiting to make a profit. There is no national disaster where somebody is not making a profit. They take advantage of the situation. But Timothy, you raised a very important point, and this is the interplay between the local and the global. When we analyze this, as you did, the issue of COVID and the prospects of how we get out of it, we cannot ignore the historical evolution of how, at the global level, by the richer countries, they have been dealing with this issue. Right here, where I live, here in Maryland, I went to a pharmacy the other day, and the pharmacist was telling me, she said, listen, we have all these vaccines here, and nobody's coming to get the vaccine. And there are people in the global south, the people don't have any vaccine. So you are making a very good point. We have a world order that has historically, from conquest, colonialism to now, continues to be a system that is a world order that is not geared to attend to the aspirations, the problems, and the challenges of people in the developing country. And that is why there is an extra responsibility on our leadership, that they have to be clear about how they deal with these things. And one of their best ammunitions that they could use to fight all these issues that they face, that they do not have control, is to be very transparent and accountable to their own people. And I think you made a very good assessment. I don't think any government official should be obsessed with your assessment. It's a correct assessment that they took the right approach. They gave priority to getting the vaccines. The World Health Organization, in many ways, that had its hands tied, because it became a political situation there under President Trump, and now there's an attempt to disentangle. So all these things takes time, but I also do believe, you did, Timothy, you didn't comment on this, but how have we been doing with social distancing and using our masks? Do you believe we Guyanese as a population have been doing enough in that regard, Timothy?
Paul, before Timothy
go
answers,
ahead.
if I may just add a different perspective to what he outlined vis-a-vis US versus India's involvement in health in Guyana. We have to look at the time frame and the peaks in the death rate of Americans in the US versus out of India. When 3,000 citizens were dying daily in the US, India did not have that problem. When the US was in number 2 in death rates and had hotspots in places like New York and New Jersey, India was not experiencing that problem. So the administration was right, absolutely right, in taking care of producing enough for the entire nation before they start giving it to any other small nation. Whereas India didn't have the enormous problem that the US had. And nobody believed that a first world country like the US would have had a death rate over 600,000 people and 3,000 to 4,000 people dying a day without vaccines. So when we make that comparison about India's generosity and that of the US, we have to look at the circumstances and the data in terms of the death rate, mortality, and the number of folks who got sick and were in hospitals compared between the two countries. And India was, some said the Indians were immune. Some people thought that India had some magic pill or they were immune because of their diet. That was the thing that were being said but now India has been struck with it. They're now where the US was a year ago. So to correct that assessment
one of the reasons for that is the migration problem they had. A lot of people had to go back to India and so on and so forth. And then there was a second wave, of the virus and all that. But
but everything still comes down to the data in terms of numbers.
Wayne, the point you're making is a valid point, but it does not nullify the observation of Timothy, where he said that India was quite generous, because it's not only with Guyana, Barbados, and Dominica, and Bangladesh, and a lot of countries. And they were speaking about COVID diplomacy. Even there were articles I read about China and India playing in terms of how they were dealing with COVID. So Timothy's point is valid.
And that's right from that perspective, Paul. But let me just add, he's right from that perspective.
Go ahead.
But right now, or recently, the US had to be sending oxygen to India because India had a shortage of oxygen because of the spike in the death rates. So what they were able to do at that point in time, and foreign policy as it pertains to COVID-19 is different with each country. And each country has its right to determine how it's going to utilize its resources for other countries. And the US hasn't given it to any particular country. 100 million has gone to some UN distribution for several other countries. So we can't compare it.
I think Timothy probably could confirm this, but from what I read, we've gotten vaccines from China, we've gotten from Russia, and we have gotten from World Health Organization, right? We've been having from multiple sources, and then we had to go and purchase through the intermediary, as Timothy said. And I agree with Timothy. If your people are threatened and you have to pay a higher price and you have the money, you got to do it, because it's only one life people have. They don't have 2 or 3 or 4. And so this is very important. But I agree with Timothy also that, and that's the thing with politicians. I don't know what they're afraid of. Tell the people the truth, just tell them what it is, and the people will stand with you, whatever it is. And even if you, like all human beings, you've committed a contradiction, they'll forgive you. They forgive you for the fact that you came and you told them the truth. But this is a new kind of culture would have to be introduced in Guyana. But Timothy, I want to get back to before we go off the subject of COVID, 2 questions I want to ask.
But before you do, Paul,
go ahead.
I wouldn't like to take away from what Wayne said, because there is a lot of truth in what Wayne said. We know that the US recently sent oxygen to India, and we know that we can't look at this in terms of black and white. There are shades of gray. So I don't think it's fair just to discount it.
Yeah.
There are 2 more factors that I would like to add, though. The first was the ridiculous Trump policy when the COVID issue first arose. And as you know, Trump's denial of the importance of the thing and that it was invented by foreigners. He called it the Chinese bug and that kind of thing. So that delayed a meaningful and early approach to a solution. The second was that because there wasn't that direct early approach, countries were contracting with manufacturers, with the pharmaceuticals, to purchase their products. And in fact, there was a period of time when the pharmaceuticals were breaching those contracts because they were prohibited from supplying when the penny dropped that this thing was serious and we needed it for our own people. So there are many variables that affect the decision making. But at the end of the day, I think what for me was the most significant was that we know that Pfizer and the large pharmaceuticals did the science, got the vaccines up and running. But when we knew we had a pandemic, it was absolutely inexcusable for there even to be a discussion that the patents needed to be protected so that the pharmaceuticals in India and China could not borrow the technology and start mass producing the same vaccines to vaccinate the third world that can't afford the high-priced Pfizer and AstraZeneca drugs that are made in the States and Canada and England. When you have a vaccine, yes, patents are important and protecting patent technology is important. Great. The Colonel's secret recipe must be kept secret. But when people are dying and when you are hoarding, it was not appropriate at that time to even deliberate for a minute, let alone for the length of time that they deliberated, to try to protect their patents so that they could make $1 off of people dying. And I had a problem with that.
No, Timothy, you're making a very important point. I was in Seattle at the World Trade Organization that exploded into massive demonstrations and virtually a breakup of the meetings there. And it was over the same issue where the manufacturers of the drug to deal with AIDS, HIV/AIDS, did not want the African countries to import the medicine from India and from Brazil and other countries. And the Africans couldn't afford it, and people were dying. I had a professor when I was doing my master's program, Johns Hopkins. He was then about 65 years old. He told me he went to Botswana, and he was the oldest man in Botswana. you know, people were dying, and it is a serious matter that you have raised there. That at the global level, we have to see some kind of vigorous global health, public health system. We have to strengthen the World Health Organization. I have my student, I teach a course now, graduate course in security and global institutions, and each one of them did a paper for the midterm on India, China, US, and so forth, on how their policies and the implementation of policies with COVID undermines or enhance global security. And it has some very serious repercussions on the entire system in the world. And you raise the point, Wayne, of cybersecurity. So one thing we know, and we always knew throughout our existence as human beings, is that we are very vulnerable. And the vulnerability comes in multiple forms. And we are learning in Guyana, where, you know, we had very much of a traditional society. As we enter more the globalizing world, we become more vulnerable too, and we have less resources and less tools to respond effectively. We don't have it as much as the developed countries, and they are facing challenges. So it's not going to be easy for us as we go forward in Guyana, but these are challenges of life and nation building that's very important. Now, I want to go to another issue that, and that is the question of oil. How does the oil industry and the gas industry and the income coming from that money, how do you believe it will assist us to effectively address these issues so that the grassroots people can benefit? Because right now, what is threatened, the livelihoods of families throughout the country at the local level, and it's not going to be easy. So, Wayne, what is your view? Are you optimistic that there could be a rearrangement of priorities, and this oil revenue could be used, and that's part of the road towards seeing a light at the end of the tunnel with all the multiple challenges that we face?
It's not so much a rearrangement of priorities as it is a reform of the legislation. I think the Natural Resource Fund has built into it the legal parameters that allow for the use of those revenues for specific things. The process, there are two levels. One is building infrastructure, and the other is saving for the second generation, or saving for the next generations. So when you have that built in, unless you change the legislation to allow the flow of that capital, based on my understanding, then those funds will not be used for things like relief at this point in time. And I agree, it should be changed. I believe strongly that building or saving for the next generation can be done by preparing for the next generation, meaning don't put the money in all the mutual funds and all of these wonderful assets to generate interest like Norway has done, because Norway is in a different position, or has been in a different position than Guyana for 30 or 40 or 50 years. We're now starting. We need to build our country and build an economy with that revenue, as they all did, and then we can start thinking about building for the saving for the next generation. So to answer your question, Paul, that's not going to happen until the framework of the legislation around NRF is revised, modified, changed to allow the flow of that revenue to do the little things that are required to relieve the people who are suffering right now. And Timothy might know better on the legislative aspect of NRF. Based on the information I have in the sovereign wealth fund that Guyana has at the Reserve Bank in New York, $295 million, they can't touch it in this regard to use it to alleviate the problems that we're having right now. I think, Timothy, you know a little better than I do.
Timothy, what's your view of what he said?
There's a structure created, yes, under the Petroleum Act. This committee to be created and how the money is to be spent and who approves and all of that. What we keep losing sight of in all our fancy talk in Guyana is that government controls parliament. That law could change in a day. The present regime, one of the earliest things they did was raise the debt ceiling by going to parliament to get it done. You got a majority in parliament, you do what you want. So if we're talking about what can and can't be done, the government of the day has carte blanche. They could go and change the law and they can do it. If we're talking about the policy that we think should be implemented, I agree with what Wayne is saying, that the money can't just be put up when we have immediate needs. We have people who are desperately poor, who do not see light at the end of the tunnel, who do not have hope. We also have leaders who have demonstrably shown that they are incapable of making good decisions on how to spend money. We have projects that have failed. We have white elephants that have been built. We have projects that are contemplated now that are doomed to fail. We close down a sugar estate, then we try to revive the dead sugar estate. It is one thing to say we have immediate needs and we need to spend the money sensibly. But when you look at the leadership that we have been shown in Guyana, who do you entrust that responsibility to? That's what I worry about. And I really hope that if the decision is made that there must be expenditure, that decision is taken by a group that represents both sides of our divide. Because if it's not, then it will be subject to the same levels of corruption, the same levels of mismanagement that we have seen for 50 years. And that is what worries me more than putting the money in the bank and waiting for somebody else to spend it later on. Because if it is misspent now, then we lose corn and husk. Now, the priority for us has got to be dealing with poverty, because we are already seeing in our oil economy that a small percentage of people are becoming very wealthy very quickly. And we are seeing a large percent of people who continue to be marginalized. and there is a growing dissatisfaction in the society. You see, because our society is small and because we live in a relatively small geographic area, you can't hide your wealth. When I'm riding my bicycle and you're driving past with your sirens and your Land Cruiser, the disparity is obvious, and therefore the discontent is real and immediate. And unless we can address that, our society is going to crumble. We've already seen crime on the increase because of increased unemployment.
Yeah.
We have already felt that you are unsafe. You got signs going up and alerts going up. Don't walk on the seawall between Vincent and the Marriott. It's unsafe. Now, if our society continues to crumble and no steps are taken to alleviate poverty, to give people hope, we will have a crisis. And the first step to me is to understand what is causing the poverty so that we can fix it.
That's a very good point that you raise about the crime, and that definitely is something that is arisen. Even here in America, I just saw before I came down here the television that the President of the United States is addressing the issue of crime, and he has a whole 1 hour outline of policies to deal with it. The issue, these problems are always interrelated, but you did speak correctly when you said that poverty is the mother of a lot of these problems, and it has to be addressed, and that Guyana is a small society. You know, I once told a president I interviewed on television, a president from Guyana. I said, my brother, you see, in America, if you build a big house, nobody really see it. But in Guyana, if you had a little house and then suddenly you build a big house, then everybody first thing they ask where you getting money from. You know what I mean? Overnight. So this issue of everybody knowing what's going on in Guyana in more ways than one is a truism that goes on, and therefore there is great need to address these issues. But the crime problem is a serious problem, and it needs a total re-examination. And I think, Wayne, when you all had that big conference with the diaspora, with the president speaking, the vice president, and various ministers, I think the Minister of Home Affairs came under a lot of questions from folks, because that is an issue that the diaspora community, in terms when they're talking of the diaspora returning to Guyana, that is an issue that they've raised. Now, two other issues I'd like to touch before we close the program is that in this speech I read by the president that he did, he spoke about the constitutional reform. What, in your opinion, gentlemen, I have been hearing about this constitutional reform over the years, but I have not seen anything that informs me that people in communities will have the right to directly elect a member to represent them in Parliament. I have not seen anything that tells me that party paramountcy will be terminated, which was officialized and institutionalized in the 78th referendum. I have not seen anything that touches the powers of the executive presidency. So what kind of cosmetic constitutional reforms are we talking about, and consultations? What are the expectations for this? They're going to be a radical reform of the Constitution, a new Constitution, or what? Wayne, what is your view? You've been telling me that you have some views on this.
Paul, the history demonstrates that no administration is serious about diminishing the executive power that they can hold once they're in office, and that any constitutional reform will be flawed and consists of several areas where it is not in the benefit and interest of the constituency. Let me go back quickly to tell you where they have faulted and what they did. During the new administration, Nagamutu was, I think, assigned to oversee the constitution reform. Nigel Hughes, his form was played quite a bit. to come up with a framework for it. That information never became public. I mean, I actually called Nigel's office to get information. He sent me to Nagamutu. It never became public. Prior to that, Granger, Nagamutu, and a few others were on committees in Parliament for constitutional reform going back to 2010, 2012. Nothing came of it. The last reform was pretty much a joke. So I think this is an area where all Guyanese need to play a part, including the diaspora, that working together, all stakeholders look at Constitution, however they want to do it, and identify those areas that need to be changed. But then when it goes back to Parliament, how is that going to be enacted? So who will make it happen, even if it comes with the most brilliant constitutional reform from the populace, from the grassroots, from all the stakeholders, and not from the politicians? How will that pass through the system is the question.
Timothy, you're the senior counsel here. I imagine you have reflected, you have read the Constitution a couple of times. What is your view? What is the fundamental? What would you like to see reformed in that Constitution?
I agree with what Wayne said. Party in power likes the power, won't change the rules that give them the power. That's the bottom line. You can't do anything about that. So, electoral fraud kept Burnham in power for many years. Chetty wanted, after a while, he gave up trying to win. He wanted shared governance. Burnham had no interest in that because he could stay in power. Interestingly enough, after 92, there was no move made by Chetty or his successors to change the Constitution, as Wayne points out. And it took Hoyt, who I continue to feel has been our best president, about 7-8 years before the penny dropped that he wasn't going to get back in power, and he started to say shared governance is a good idea. Now, the PPP represents half of the people. APNU represents half of the people. It can never be right for either the PPP or APNU to have total control of the executive and therefore of the legislative. And that is what our system gives us in Guyana. And recognizing that injustice, the next thing we have to recognize is that neither the PPP nor APNU will change it, because once they're in power, they enjoy the power, and you need 2/3 majority to change the Constitution. So Wayne talked about I think he said ridiculous changes that were made last time there was constitutional reform, so-called reform. Again, I entirely agree with him. The one meaningful thing I saw was that they limited the presidency. It could only sit as president for 2 terms. And that was touted as revolutionary. Well, all of the people in the parties, both parties, who have brown-nosed their way up to the top, are all there because they are ambitious. They want to get to the top. And it's very difficult to get to the top if you have an institution, if you have a messiah, like a Chetty Jagan, there as president. He's not going to step down for his lifetime, so what chance do you have to replace him unless you limit him for the 2 terms? So the changes that we see in the Constitution and in legislation are not made for the good of the country. They're made for the good of the party. And even those changes often are not so much for the good of the party, but for the preservation of party dominance and to allow the individuals who have been loyal to the party as they move up in the party to get to the top. It is done on the basis of selfish priority rather than patriotic priority. And we have seen that time and again. So I agree with what Wayne is saying. We're not going to move. We have to find another way, another solution. We will not have constitutional reform in a meaningful way by either the 2 parties.
One last point I'd like to raise. Before I raise it, I'd like to remind our audience that we are going to do this program called People's Voice the 3rd Wednesday of every month, and we'd like you to participate. And we are asking you, wherever you are as a Guyanese, at home or abroad, to do a short 2 minutes video or voice call and send it to 631-782-9272 WhatsApp. Send it before the third week of each month, so about what issue you're facing, so that, and your views on it, and so that we could put it up into the program and be able to make comments about it. We also have a hotline that you could call to make calls to this program during the time of the program. Many viewers are there to give you a short, sharp, and focused opinion about what you think about the issues we are discussing, or if you would like to ask a question. Now, lastly, before we go, gentlemen, I'd like to ask your opinion that in this document I read of the President's speech to the 12th Parliament, he speaks of establishing legally in Parliament a commission, a One Guyana Commission. And he's saying that his concept for unifying the country will be within the framework of a concept of One Guyana, which includes inclusivity and so forth. So I'd like to have your reaction to it. Wayne, first with you as a leader of an organization of Guyanese abroad. What do you think about this one concept, a One Guyana concept, and the idea of having a legal framework approved by Parliament for a commission to do it? And then we'll ask Timothy, who's on the ground.
Guyana suffers from a couple of things, one of which is the lack of enough human capital to develop the country and to sustain prosperity. And that's because of the divisiveness in Guyana that's been there for quite a long time. So any policy, any initiative or program to unite the Guyanese in Guyana to work collaboratively and cooperatively towards the betterment of all of Guyana is a powerful, wonderful initiative. How it's going to be accomplished is an interesting fact, but I do believe that the march of 1,000 leagues begins with the first step, and it's a move in the right direction. And I also say that this administration has also moved in the right direction when it comes to trying to engage the diaspora and be serious about engaging the diaspora. And that was exemplified when there was an inaugural meeting, a webinar on May 22nd, in which the president was there, the vice president, and about 5 ministers of government talking to 600 members of the diaspora around the world. So that signaled some seriousness by this government to engage the diaspora in this, even in the One Guyanese effort, because we in overseas Guyanese are also Guyanese, we're all one. So I do believe that any commission formed to do that is a good move and should be applauded.
Good. One of the things I want to point out to you, Wayne, is that if you check the websites of migration, people in line to go to Canada and the US, there are thousands of Guyanese in line to come abroad currently that are, it could be, you could check the website, you'll see it. So another time we'll talk about this, that the migration towards outside of Guyana continues. And I know the government is talking about connecting with the diaspora to get Guyanese to go back to provide talent and so forth. But I'm just pointing out the reality. If you check the website, you'll see Guyanese quite a few seats are going to come abroad in the next. Anyhow, let's move on.
Just quickly, if I can respond. That is not new. That's been a trend for 5 decades. So there are two factors. There's a push factor that causes people to want to leave, and a pull factor. And the push factors in Guyana remain the same from 50 or 55 or 60 years ago. And the pull factors in places like the US and Canada kind of remain the same. So you will always have that migration path and pattern.
Okay. Timothy, we give you the last few minutes that is left of the program to provide us with your opinion on this legal framework that would be established in Parliament for a One Guyana Commission. What are the prospects in your view of this One Guyana Commission addressing the the dream of having a one Guyana, or the vision?
I have no doubt that Irfan Ali wishes to leave a legacy that he can be proud of. And therefore, like every other leader that we have seen, he would like to represent the entire population and not just his half of the population. One Guyana speaks to that. I applaud any effort to bring Guyanese together, to remind us that we are all under one umbrella and hiding behind one seawall, and that our needs and our fears and our triumphs are the same. It has never worked so far. And unless the leaders realize that actions speak louder than words, it will not work in the future. I would have liked to see in 2015, when the APNU coalition took power, that they had invited Ashni Singh, whom I consider to be one of the brightest ministers I have come across and a fantastic Minister of Finance, to remain as Minister of Finance and invite him into cabinet so that there's real transparency. That never happened. People would have laughed at me for suggesting that. I would have liked to see now that PPP had won in 2020, that they invite Carl Greenwich to act as Minister of Foreign Affairs and to sit in cabinet so the discussions have real transparency. People would laugh at me for suggesting that. But actions speak louder than words. And unless you show that you are embracing everyone in your policies and in your directions, you could appoint committees and talk tanks and all kind of thing, and no one is convinced. Half of Guyana is convinced that the current government is against them. 3 years ago, half of Guyana was convinced that the then current government was against them. And you could talk cheese about one Guyana. Half of Guyana will not be convinced. You have to demonstrate it by your actions. And until we learn that viscerally in our gut, that we have to demonstrate it by our actions, we fail before we start.
Wonderful. That is a wonderful reflection by Timothy. I recall when I was a permanent representative of the World Confederation of Labor, the United Nations, we had a big meeting to discuss reform of the United Nations. And I spoke on behalf of the United Labor Movement around the world. And one of the things I said was that vision without implementation is hallucination. And I agree with you. I will still advise people that it's very important. Dr. Mohammed Irfan Ali, His Excellency, is the president. I've read this document that he did to the Parliament, the 12th Parliament, and I will strongly advise that people read it, because if you don't read what is being presented by the president, you would not be able, when you meet him as he goes around the country, to hold his feet to the fire. So I have read it. I advise you to read it and have a critical view of it. Look at how you believe that these policies could work, will not work if they're not working. Because he is the president and he's running the country right now, and he bears the responsibility. The buck stops with him. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to our program. I look forward to receiving your through WhatsApp at the number we gave you of your 2 minutes video about the issues and the challenges you are facing, whether you are in any part of the world, at home and abroad. Until next time, I'm Paul Nero, Tennessee for Globespan. Thank you.